Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
And welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. My name is Dan Rundy. I'm a Senior Vice President. I hold the Schreier Chair in Global Analysis, and I direct the project on Prosperity and Development. For the second year running, CSIS has worked on the vital role that creative economies play in economic development, thanks to the Taiwanese Ministry of Culture's generous support and confidence in our work. With more than 24 expert interviews spanning across 3 continents, we are releasing today a new research report, Creative Economies in the Indo-Pacific and COVID-19. And we'll discuss the lessons we learned from Australia and India in the success of their own creative economies. My special thanks to Blair Sullivan and Bo Carlson for their excellent research and writing support in this project. When we took on this project, we never imagined being stuck in our homes and going all digital to release this report. An incredibly destructive and disruptive force, COVID-19's nature is such that it is pushing us all into a digital paradigm and forcing many sectors of the economies to rethink business models. The creative economy sector, however, has been holding its ground steadily through all of this. Unsurprising, as the industry has historically been more resilient to economic shocks than others. In the face of the 2008 financial crisis, even as international trade declined by 12%, trade in creative goods and services continued to grow. Our new report lays out the findings from this research while also highlighting how Taiwan can operationalize its new Southbound Policy by tapping into the region's potential for the creative sector and supplementing the United States' efforts to secure a free and open Indo-Pacific. Moreover, this study of creative industries in the Indo-Pacific region also demonstrates the central role of creative industries in driving a more resilient global economic recovery from COVID-19. Creative economies in the developing world have several opportunities that should be tapped into as governments continue to plan for resilient post-pandemic recovery. As the global economy shifts towards further digital knowledge and transformation, and as developing countries in the Indo-Pacific and Latin America evolve in their foreign policy priorities, the United States and Taiwan can potentially work together to achieve more significant levels of economic development and cooperation through the creative economy sector. To help us understand how international development actors, government officials in emerging markets, and private sector actors can help unlock regional and global security and resilient economic development, we have an impressive group of people joining us digitally today, beginning with my very good friend, Dr. Carlos Diaz Rocha. Dr. Diaz Rocha is the Senior Deputy Chairman and Chief Operating Officer of the National Endowment for the Humanities, who has kindly agreed to deliver the keynote remarks this morning. Dr. Diaz Rocha, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Dan. Can you hear me fine? Great. Thank you for the invitation to be part of this discussion on the global importance of the creative economy. It's always a pleasure to be with CSIS. And also it's a pleasure to be with our close friends in Taiwan, with whom we share so many common interests. Dan, as you know, COVID-19 presents a unique challenge to economies throughout the world, especially those that rely so heavily on in-person attendance, as many sectors within the creative economy do. One of the most significant challenges of this year, and perhaps well beyond this year, is to do what we can to help save the creative economy and harness it to lead us into full economic recovery, hopefully very soon. I firmly believe that it's not enough for the creative industries to hunker down and to wait for the pandemic to pass. The creative economists need to innovate. They need to learn not only how to survive in this environment, but how to thrive and be better than they were before the pandemic. In the United States, as you know, the creative economy comprises anywhere between 4% and up to 11% of our nation's GDP, depending on how you measure the creative economy. The most conservative estimates pointed at a little bit more than 4%. And if you were to include other sectors that are critical to the creative economy, and that I would argue are also part of the creative economy, such as the educational sector, cultural tourism, the number goes into the low single digits, close to 11%. So it's a significant segment of our economy in general. That is why we as an agency like to act as incubators of innovation. Part of my job here is to ensure that the creative economy in the US is as vibrant as it can be and that it receives the attention it deserves from our federal government. I often say that our grants are catalytic, and that's because they generate a multiplier effect that is far, far greater than the actual dollars that go into our grant. And we do this not by dictating policy from right here in Washington, D.C., but by sending the resources needed to fund local projects throughout the United States. Let me tell you one example of how we do this, which is structurally in our legislation. 40% of our grant-making budget goes directly to our 56 state and territorial partners throughout the United States. We believe that local communities know how to spend their money best. And so that's why 40% of the budget goes directly to these communities. And so we play a critical role in supporting culture in the United States by sending that money directly to the local communities, because we, as I say, we think that they know best how to spend those resources. And I think that could be said not only here in the US, but also around the world. And make no mistake, we recognize that there are greater implications to a strong and healthy cultural economy than just dollars and cents, in addition to the intellectual curiosity and the emotional well-being that investments in culture provide. As President Trump's national security strategy makes it very clear, economic security is national security, and therefore a sector that is as large and as fast growing as the creative economy is needs to be part of any conversation about economic security, and by definition, about national security. And one of the things I really enjoy about your report, and I'm going to get to this in a second, is how you highlight the different sectors within the creative economy and talk about how they expand and contract to different external forces. And so if I can just pivot for just a couple of minutes to talk about the report, which I know we're going to talk a lot more about going forward. Let me tell you that I really enjoyed all of it, but there's three things in particular that I enjoyed about this report. First is how you really emphasize the resilience of the creative industries. If I can quote the first couple of sentences from the report. Historically, creative industries have been more resilient to economic shocks than other sectors of the global economy. In the face of the 2008 financial crisis, global trade declined by 12%, yet trading creative goods and services continued to grow. So when I read that introduction, the first question that popped into my mind was, well, how about now? How are the creative industries doing right now during this pandemic? And I was thrilled that in the next few sentences, you give us a hint. And let me quote again, the COVID-19 epidemic is no exception when it comes to the recovery of the creative economy. Then a few sentences down, this study of creative industries in the Indo-Pacific region demonstrates significant resilience and proves the central role of creative industries in driving the global recovery from COVID-19. So I'm really eager to hear what our guests have to say about how this applies not only to the creative industries that you highlight in the report, such as film and television, gaming, music, and fashion, which have no doubt grown and thrived under the current conditions, but also those that rely on face-to-face interactions, and to be blunt, on ticket sales, like museums, like theaters, like all these parts of the creative industry that really rely on people going to places to see, to hear, to take part in a cultural experience. We know that big museums like the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City or the Art Institute in Chicago and so many other institutions in the big cities of this great country are going to be just fine. But our mission here at the NEH is to make sure that all Americans have access to cultural resources. And so we're really focusing on those areas of the country, the rural areas, that would not have the benefits of a thriving cultural sector were it not for the infusion of federal dollars that go into these lesser known institutions of higher education, museums, libraries, archives, you name it. That is why we're doing what we can to provide much needed funding to these small town museums and organizations which don't have the type of resources that the big museums and the big cultural organizations on the coasts tend to have. The second thing that I really like about the report is the emphasis that you place on soft power, a term coined by one of your board members and my former colleague Joe and I, which is really, really, really critical and speaks to what I said before, the concept of economic security being part of national security. We know that hard power, military power, is essential to winning wars, but soft power is really key to maintaining peace among nations. And the emphasis that the report places on soft power, I think, is terrific. And that's really what we fund here, the work of historians, translators, anthropologists, individuals who really do their best to promote soft power in the US and abroad. And then third, I like the emphasis on having some good policy recommendations, addressing the question of how to build on the creative economy's resilience that you mentioned in the first part of the report to inform our efforts to respond to COVID-19 and to future crises. That is, I think, why it's so important for the report to conclude, and now I'm quoting from the report, by offering ideas on how to facilitate the ongoing success of the creative economies of the Indo-Pacific, both during and after the pandemic, and maximize resilience and prosperity. So you're doing a lot more than just talk about the importance of the creative economy and more than just talk about how resilient they are, but you're offering a clear roadmap for how to build on that resilience to create economies that are strong and healthy going forward. I really look forward to taking part of the discussion and listening to the recommendations and learning from the experience of our friends in Taiwan and what others are doing so that we can do what we do here in the US even better. Thank you again for the opportunity, and I look forward to listening to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Diaz Rocha. We so appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. Those are very helpful remarks. I'm going to now ask Chris Metzger, co-author of this report and my former colleague, to explain how stakeholders can operationalize and develop creative economies based on the lessons from Australia and India. Chris, thanks so much for all the work you did on the report. I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
Thanks, Dan, and thank you to everyone who was able to join us today. I'm here to talk about some of the recommendations from our report, the creative economies in the Indo-Pacific and COVID-19. The show must go on. Dr. Diaz Rocha went through some of the highlights of our report, and we're excited to share it with you today. I am a former research associate on the Project on Prosperity and Development and currently a master's student in the Global Human Development Program at Georgetown. I had the opportunity to travel to Sydney and Canberra, Australia with Dan Rundy in March 2020. So a lot has happened since then, but we're very excited to share some of the findings from the 2 case studies on India and on Australia. So as Dr. Diaz Rocha mentioned, the creative economies have been disrupted by COVID-19, just like many other sectors of the global economy, but they have shown great resilience. For this report, we focused on 4 different sectors: film and television, gaming, music, and fashion industries in the Indo-Pacific. We've seen that streaming services for film, television, and music, as well as online gaming and e-commerce platforms, have actually seen increases in usage. We'll see a theme through our report was the introduction of technology into the creative sectors and seeing how that has kind of increased their resilience to disruption associated with working from home, social distancing protocols as well. And so here are the 8 lessons, the main takeaways from the report. I'll go through them 2 at a time. There was a lot of interviews that we conducted virtually with colleagues in India and then in person in March in Australia, as I mentioned. And so the first one is play to the crowd. You can see on the left of my screen, I have a photo of the cast of the South Korean film Parasite at the 92nd Academy Awards earlier this year. This was the first non-English language film to win the Oscar for Best Picture. It demonstrates the growing demand for creative products from the Indo-Pacific in the United States and in other countries. The second recommendation from the report I mentioned a little bit earlier was that with many people working from home, creative industry leaders should look to integrate technology into their businesses, whether it's creating a website, an e-commerce platform, or selling their goods online, or even many creative products can be streamlined through the use of technology as well. So recommendation 3 is operate with confidence. Most businesses in the creative economy have a customer base. It's just a matter of connecting the creative products with customers. So we encourage people to think beyond just their local markets and look to expand further within countries and even globally. As I mentioned, there's a growing demand in the US and in the West for South Korean music, for K-pop, for film, for different products of that nature as well. And then recommendation 4 is really important. It's invest in public goods. A lot of businesses within the creative economies weren't prepared to forego revenue for 6 months. As Dr. Diaz Rocha mentioned, a lot of them depend heavily on government funding from central governments or local arts guilds or local government bodies. And so continuing to invest in creative businesses as countries think through their COVID-19 recovery plans is very important. On the left of my screen now, you can see indigenous art. That ties into recommendation 5, protect the brand. Indigenous art is some of the most counterfeit and the most forgery, the art with the most forgeries in the world. And so improving copyright protections, cataloging creative products would go a long way towards reducing counterfeit products across the globe and returning revenue towards these communities that desperately need it. Recommendation 6 is create and expand the cultural exchange programs. This is really important because it forms connections between creative sectors in different countries, as well as forms relationships between countries on, collaborations such as film festivals, music, and other things of that nature. So recommendation 6 is walk the tightrope. Some of the solutions that we observed in our case studies don't apply to every country. We saw that Australia has very successfully introduced tax incentives to encourage film and television products in Sydney and around Australia. This was very successful in Australia, but we just wanted to remind people that this won't necessarily work for every country. Policymakers need to really gauge the pros and cons of tax incentives, because as we mentioned, we don't want creative businesses to become solely dependent on government funding as every country is struggling to rebuild their economies in the wake of COVID-19. And then our final recommendation is hold the spotlight. I think this one is a really important one because, as I mentioned at the beginning, the demand for creative products around the world is increasing. I can speak from personal experience that being stuck at home has given me a newfound appreciation for going to the movies or the film sector, fashion sector. And so I think that now is an opportunity to really expand creative industries around the world as we rebuild our economies. And we just wanted to thank everyone for joining us today. This is just kind of a snapshot of the findings from our report, and we hope you'll read the whole thing and enjoy the rest of the discussions today.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks again. You did a great job on the work, and congratulations for being at Georgetown. I'm glad you were there. We have a really great panel. I encourage you to download the report, but we've got this great panel that's going to help us unpack some of the salient points from the report. First, joining us live from Taipei, we have the Taiwanese Deputy Minister for Culture, Chun Heng Peng. From USAID, we have Deputy Assistant Administrator for Asia, Gloria Steele. Thank you, Gloria, for being here. And finally, we have my friend and colleague, Rick Rosso, who holds the Wadhwani Chair for U.S.-India Policy Studies here at CSIS and has been an incredible partner for us with this project. Thank you all for being here. This is really tremendous. Let me start with the Deputy Minister, if I may. So Deputy Minister, it's a pleasure to have you join our event, and we are very grateful for your continued partnership and support of our research work. Could I ask you to share your thoughts on how Taiwan, which has been an example of success stories with its creative economy sector, has thrived during COVID-19?
Okay.
We're having a delay because there's a simultaneous translation. Mr. Peng?
Mr. Rundy, panelists, members of the CSIS team, and all of our online attendees, greetings. Thank you so much to the CSIS team for working so hard to finish this research project during the whole pandemic time. Mr. Rundy, members of the CSIS team, panelists, all of our online attendees, greetings. Thank you so much to the CSIS team. Thank you for working so hard to finish this research project during the pandemic. We in Taiwan did such a good job of preventing the spread, and our prevention task force did such a great job that we only have 513 confirmed cases and 7 deaths. We did such a good job with that we in Taiwan actually expect 1.5% positive economic growth this year, while the rest of the world is experiencing such difficult times. And so we are happy to share our experience with all of you today. Of course, when it comes to cultural industries, before this, but especially now, since the break of the pandemic, we had the movie theaters closed, we had the museums closed, and it was very bad for creative individuals and people in the industry. This affected their lives in a terrible way. But by May of this year, we were able to stabilize the situation, and we started to open arts and culture venues little by little in accordance with regulations. As we reached last month at the Taipei Arena, we had the first concert in the world since the start of the pandemic with 10,000 people there. And I know that Hollywood has stopped filming a lot of mini films and movie theaters have been shut down at such a time like this. But during this time, we in Taiwan have worked through streaming platforms to share our excellent works with everyone around the world. We had Workers, which was a drama on HBO Asia. And we also had a police thriller called Victims Game on Netflix, which 190 countries were able to watch. And we have so much different variety in our subject matter that shows how our open environment is so conducive and fosters creative works. And we also have been working to promote cross-platform joint production and sales. So audiences all around the world have had more opportunities to watch Taiwan's amazing films and television series. How did Taiwan do this? Our response was guided by the principles of first preventing the spread. That was the most important thing. But at the same time, on the policy side, we worked on delivering financial relief and then recovery. First, early in the pandemic, we did an impact assessment, and then we did 2 rounds of relief for arts and culture. And by May, we began a gradual reopening of arts and culture venues. And we worked through arts fund vouchers to help the arts and culture industries recover. And when the pandemic first hit, the first thing we did was got to do an assessment of the industry. There was a hit at the box office, exhibits had been closed internationally and domestically, and people in the industry were definitely having a hard time making ends meet. So we did this impact assessment as quickly as we could, and then we carried out 2 rounds of relief in a total of 161 million US dollars to help the workers and the businesses in the industry get through the hardest time. And as of August, we had already helped 7,800 relief payments made to institutions, and about 15,800 relief payments had been made to individuals. This was to help them get through the hardest time. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Deputy Minister. The last few months have made it very clear why having a free and open Indo-Pacific strategy should be at the top of the priority list.
Reopening of arts and culture venues. What we did was we had mandatory taking of people's temperatures, and they had to wear masks by everyone the entire time.
Victoria, I'm going to go. The last few months has made it very clear why having a free and open Indo-Pacific strategy should be at the top of the priority list for anyone interested in global peace and prosperity. How do you envision expanded intercultural relationships with other countries, especially in the creative economy sector, critical for enhanced regional cooperation in the Indo-Pacific? I'm going to operate as if he didn't hear that because of technical issues. I'm going to move on to Gloria Steele. Gloria, thanks so much for joining us this morning. One of the findings from the research work we did over the past 2 years covering Australia, India, Indonesia, and Taiwan is that there is nothing more fundamental to the growth of the creative sector, and indeed any economic sector, than good governance, capacity building, democratic institutions, a free civil society, and enforcement of intellectual property rights. Could I ask you to share with our viewers how USAID engages in some of the development exercises and talk to us about the work ahead that also needs to be done?
好像可以了吧？
Thank you very much, Dan, and thank you for inviting me to this very interesting discussion. As you know, in 2017, the administration launched the Indo-Pacific Strategy. At USAID, we prioritized strengthening democratic systems and private sector-led growth in the Indo-Pacific. And we saw that a lot of the issues that constrain growth are a weak regulatory environment, which creates disincentives for investments and makes doing business very difficult and cumbersome, a weak rule of law that makes enforcement of contracts and of intellectual property rights almost impossible, corruption in all its forms, lack of infrastructure, including infrastructure for digital connectivity, a constrains fiscal space that makes it difficult for government to invest in the necessary infrastructure, soft and hard. And Chris had talked about some subsidies that are needed in the creative sector. And so that would be affected, and a lack of human capacity. What we have learned during our implementation, the first couple of years of our implementation of the Indo-Pacific Strategy is among all the factors that either provide incentive or make it a disincentive to invest in the growth of the private sector has been related to democratic systems. The growing authoritarianism in the region has made corruption even more prevalent, control of information and technologies become a problem, and the curtailment of freedoms, civil liberties, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and freedom of expression. And these have important considerations, factors, and implications on the growth of the creative industries, which, by the way, as we have worked with our partner countries in the Indo-Pacific region, we have not considered, and we should, given the resilience that the study that Chris has put forward. And I think that the lessons we've learned in trying to strengthen democratic systems, addressing corruption, and fostering civil liberties and freedoms are important for the growth of creative sector, and which we could continue working on, especially in collaboration with civil society. So there is that. We have confirmed that that is definitely very important. I do want to spend a minute on capacity building, which you mentioned, and human capacity. We have been about 2/3 of USAID's investment in the Indo-Pacific is on human capacity, capacity development. A large part of that is health, and we don't need to go into why that is important. But the rest of it is education. And in the education sector, we are trying to reform the way that learning is done by promoting more innovation, more creativity in lieu of rote memorization. And I think that is going to be important as we try to promote the creative industries. In the higher education, we are working with governments to reform curriculum so that they are more responsive to the needs of the industry. And if we're going to promote the growth of the creative sector, I think this is going to be an important part of what we do, is to make sure that they develop and strengthen curricula in the arts and in the other areas that the creative industries will be required to depend on them on. Let me stop there, but I think I thought it was a very interesting report, and I've learned more from it than I'm contributing here, because I think that we will be able to adjust some of the work that we're doing in the in democracy and good governance in order to promote creative industries.
Thank you so much, Gloria, for this. I'm really grateful for your participation. I want to move to my friend and colleague Rick Rosso. I know Rick's time is tight, so I want to get a couple questions in while I have you, Rick. Rick, you've been a critical and valuable partner in this endeavor, and we're really grateful for all your support. No one needs to explain why India was chosen as one of the case studies for successful creative economies. Long an industry of national pride, Bollywood movies and productions are now quite popular in cultural contexts outside of India, from Eastern Europe to Latin America. So, Rick, talk a little bit about the Indian creative economy, please.
Yeah, well, Bollywood itself is the most camera ready, I think, of any of the creative economies we've looked at. Camera ready in terms of its ability to almost immediately be exported around the world for global consumption. Just a question about whether or not the great content that's being developed can find the right platforms for global distribution. but its ability to grow and really become a driver for the Indian economy, there's no question about it, as you rightly point out. It really thrived in its early days, Bollywood, because of a lack of regulation. For those of us that have done business in India, you know that a lot of sectors even today still suffer from draconian regulation that makes it difficult for companies and entrepreneurs to grow and thrive. But there's some sectors, and certainly film production was one of them, that really sort of fell outside the regulatory purview for decades, and therefore, India's entrepreneurial spirits, which you see by the diaspora when they go overseas, creating these massive companies everywhere they go. You saw that in the film industry in India, much like you saw with India's IT service market, the cable TV market. Those sectors that were relatively unregulated were the ones that really began to boom and take off. Now, India, of course, the film industry and the content industry is much more than just Bollywood. Within India, you realize Bollywood is really kind of the denotation for the film industry that's based in Bombay. And it's one of the real beautiful things about the proliferation of new digital instruments for the distribution of media content is that a lot of regional film and TV production now has a much easier time, finding an audience. Before, when there was just a few cinema houses and a few TV channels, there's only so much time for content. So you need something that, of course, is applicable across the nation. But India has, dozens of languages, dozens of prominent languages, hundreds of less prominent languages. So suddenly this proliferation of regional TV and cinema as well has really taken off. Let me just bounce, off one other theme too that came up earlier in the conversation by Dr. Diaz Rocha, which is how do you get it outside the major urban areas too? India still has relatively weak internet penetration. Fewer than a half of Indian citizens have regular access to the internet, and a much smaller subset of that has high-speed internet. But that's growing. And so now, suddenly, in India, rural India, the idea about getting content to rural India, it's not only about getting content outside the urban areas. Can they become developers themselves? Can you have successful YouTube channels where they can tap into a global audience? You've got some instances from that in India, a couple of cooking shows that have become prominent. But suddenly all these great stories and local customs and things like that, which may have some interest globally, can become untapped and unpackaged. So these global platforms for digital content, really could provide an opportunity too for employment creation, jobs, livelihood in corners of India that otherwise wouldn't have been able to tap into the creative economies. Film, obviously getting outside the Bollywood, TV, digital. These are all great things that are going to provide natural spurs, I think, for more people to really become an active part. So creative economy, big things for India, and thanks again, Dan, for tapping us for working with you on this project.
Let me just go one more time to you, Rick. I want to just, India has a unique set of geostrategic interests in the region. They have evolved in recent decades, and India is more aligned with the United States than ever before. Our shared hope of realizing some of these interests, including a free and open Indo-Pacific, rest on increased economic and soft power partnerships among like-minded countries. Could I ask you to share with our audience how you think this could be possible in the India, Taiwan, India, Australia, or India, other friendly country contexts?
Yeah, it's a brilliant question, Dan. I think, as we've seen from the U.S. lens in the last decade, in terms of hard power cooperation, these days there's very few big ideas that we can put on the table for defense and security partnership that won't at least get a fair hearing. We're signing successful defense agreements, defense exports, new exercises, so many instances where hard power, has really built those bridges in recent years. And has crossed over administrations, Democrat, Republican, it's been fairly solid throughout. But in other areas, we've had a little bit more difficult, particularly economic areas. You've seen that, very specifically, I think, since the Modi government came to office 6 years ago, where because of massive deficits in goods trade, which dwarf ours. I mean, some years India's goods trade deficit equates to anywhere from 8 to 12% of GDP. So multipliers about what the US trade deficit is. So you've seen India become more protectionist on goods trade. And from the US vantage point, any country that's closing its borders to US exports, particularly in the current environment, is being targeted pretty aggressively. So you've seen not just the United States, but Australia and others, a little bit more contentious relationship in terms of economic cooperation because of this protectionism that we've seen primarily in goods trade. But India's creative economies, these are the sectors where, frankly, India would be less scared about global competition, where they have a real opportunity to improve exports. So, there's really three areas when I think about things that Taiwan, Australia, and others can look at. Three broad themes that I think should be focused on. One is improving trade. Number two is helping India modernize, and number three is the benefits for cultural exchange. On trade, again, goods trade, very contentious. Services trade, and particularly in the creative economies, a lot of upside. So how can you improve trade relations in the services side, in the creative economy side? I think there's a lot of upside for being able to do so, and you're gonna trigger less of those protectionist instincts when you engage the Indian government in sectors where they actually have a lot of export potential and can actually gain from stronger trade relations. So it is one of those areas where it doesn't often find its way into the Track 1 dialogue as prominently as it should, but certainly it should be there. The second I mentioned is modernization. One thing that we uncovered through the study, which is for those of you that go through and read it, a lot of our respondents said, these traditional media areas, which are declining in most of the developed market, right? Newspapers and things like that, film houses, they're actually still growing in India. So you actually see a lot of India's media companies transitioning maybe a little bit more slowly than their global peers. Now that's because you put money where in industries in sectors where there's going to be growth, but India could potentially lose out on digital. You see global platforms already. Amazon and Netflix and others have taken a big slice of the Indian media pie, and if that continues to grow, where foreign players dominate that space, there could be a backlash. So frankly, when I think of what Taiwan and Australia and others can do, if there's steps you can take to help some improvement and modernization, because India still is kind of chasing, I think, areas that long term are going to be in decline, whereas a lot of our countries have already started to modernize and improve. India, I think, is maybe a step behind that, but certainly ready and primed to move. And the last area is cultural exchange. As you mentioned, Bollywood films, for instance, being seen throughout Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union, during a period when the Soviets and Indians had close ties, the Soviet Union was actively courting India for developing, for bringing a lot of film content there. And those bonds, even though the Soviet Union is 30 years gone, still continue today. It was basically kind of an exchange, right? Films for weaponry, right? Is kind of the exchange that you had for a lot of these track ones that were happening back in the day. But those cultural bonds remain today. So we've seen what an impact that has for India's ability to kind of convey what life is like, what culture is like for international audience. So trade, I think a lot less blowback and a lot more opportunity, helping India modernize. And third, there's always great benefits on cultural exchange through the creative economies, Dan.
Thanks, Rick. Let me turn to Gloria Steele. Gloria, one of the crucial investments for realizing a free and open Indo-Pacific will be in cybersecurity and digital freedom. With virtually every aspect of our daily life going digital, especially with COVID-19, where it's more Netflix and fewer movie theaters, how would you say USAID is thinking about digital safety, freedom on the internet, and security? And can we look towards some of our partners in the region, such as Taiwan and Japan, for inspiration/collaboration?
Sorry. Thank you, Dan. Absolutely. And we are working with Australia, Japan, and developing relationships with Taiwan, particularly in implementing the Indo-Pacific strategy. But going back to your question about secure communications and digital freedom, definitely we view this as very important. It's very important in achieving the goals of the Indo-Pacific strategy of promoting prosperity. It is also very important in strengthening democratic systems. So for the first time in the history of AID, last April, we launched our very first digital strategy. And in that strategy, we make a commitment to use digital digital connectivity and improve digital ecosystems as a means of accelerating returns to our investments in development and humanitarian assistance. Also, part of the Indo-Pacific strategy, the U.S. government has launched the DCCP, or digital security, the digital cybersecurity partnership, which we are implementing in a number of countries, including in India. And we will be working with India in this. Rick had mentioned the importance of working with India in modernizing and moving them along in the digital technology area, and we will be working with them on that. We are also working, so the implementation of our strategy and DCCP are all over, are in many countries now. In Timor-Leste, for instance, we're working with the government to develop their legislation on cybersecurity, promoting cybersecurity. And in the Philippines, we have been working with them in promoting e-commerce, working with the Central Bank of the Philippines and the government of the Philippines to make sure that the regulatory environment is in place to be able to promote e-commerce and electronic payments. And in the Pacific Islands, we are working very closely with Australia and Japan to expand access to digital infrastructure, even in remote atolls and islands. And we are having discussions with Taiwan to see how we can work together in this area because there are a lot of lessons to be learned from Taiwan. Thank you.
Thank you, Gloria. Let me turn back to the Deputy Minister. Deputy Minister, the last few months have made it very clear why having a free and open Indo-Pacific strategy should be at the top of the priority list for anyone interested in global peace and prosperity. How do you envision expanded intercultural relationships with other countries, especially in the creative economy sector, which would be critical for enhanced regional cooperation in the Indo-Pacific?
Yes.
While we're waiting for that, I want just to encourage everyone to download our report. It's on our website,
We at our Ministry of
CSIS.
Culture have overseas offices, and we are committed to promoting cross-cultural exchanges in the Indo-Pacific region. In the beginning of the year, we set up offices in New Delhi, India, and Sydney, Australia to promote culture exchange in the Indo-Pacific. Taiwan's cultural soft power shows our free, diverse, open, inclusive style, which fits very well with the Indo-Pacific Strategy's goals of more common prosperity, democratic governance, and regional peace. In November, as a matter of fact, the Melbourne Fringe Festival will feature Fringe-focused Taiwan. This is one of Australia's well-known arts festivals, curated with Taiwan as its main theme this year. And our ministry's results under the NSP policy is also important and shows how centrally located we are in the Southeast Asian region. In the year 2015, our ministry promoted the establishment of the Southeast Asian Advisory Committee. And all of our advisors are highly qualified members or experts of the country's arts bodies. There have already been 100 events and activities. And this is a great way to spur dialogue and collaboration among the NSP countries. We also, in our ministry, have the Youth Cultural Gardeners Project that has supported lots of delegations, over 200 artists and exchange visits. And we also have 353 people in the Southeast Asia Taiwan Cultural Exchange Program that have come to Taiwan. This shows a two-way exchange program that has brought greater understanding between us in this area and the NSP countries. And we have also plans and research projects in place to this end. These research projects and plans cover our connecting with Thailand, the Philippines, Cambodia, Vietnam, Singapore, New Zealand, Australia, Indonesia, Myanmar, Malaysia, and Laos. We have explored with them indigenous peoples and new immigrants' cultural activities, as well as the various countries' art histories, films, traditional folk music. and has showcased all the different ways we can develop better cultural links with these countries. We plan to publish the results of our research in 2021 and examine the interim results of the new Southbound Policy, exploring how to carry out more exchanges with these countries going forward. Thank you. I'm very sorry that I had technical issues today. And so there were a few things that I was not able to get in today. I'm very sorry about that.
Well, technology.
And thank you so much to everyone for your participation today.
Great. Technology is great when it works, and I think we're all in the process of being digitally transformed. What I have been saying to people is that there's been more e-commerce, more distance learning, and more e-government in the last 28 weeks than in the last 28 years. And so we're all being digitally transformed. It's not pretty, a lot of it, but we're going through the process of it. And I know AID is thinking about issues of digital transformation. We are being digitally transformed like this all over the world. And I think we're going to see the demand for digital connectivity in developing countries. It's going to mimic the demand for electricity, drinkable water, or sanitation. And either the West is going to help meet these needs or someone else is going to meet these needs. But this is going to become a critical part of modernity. So we're going to see a lot more of it. The other thing is, with creative economies, if we want to escape the middle-income country trap, if India wants to escape the middle-income country trap, Gloria is responsible for the Asia Bureau at AID. There are many countries that are in the middle-income stage of development. Countries can't just sell commodities. They can't just sell rocks in the ground or gas in the ground or coal or agricultural commodities. Those are all important. But what is needed is innovation-led economic growth. So the creative economy and culture as a driver of this, including technology, are really important, to enable the unlimited human potential that's available to all societies, but also to escape the middle-income country trap. So it requires several things. It requires education and training. It requires digital infrastructure. It requires human freedom. It helps if you've got a free society like Taiwan, or it helps if you have a free society like India. It helps if you have a free society like the United States. It helps if you have a free society like Japan. It matters. So, and yes, there's a role for government, and I'm so pleased that the Deputy Minister of Culture was with us today from Taiwan. I'm really grateful to Dr. Diaz Rocha from the National Endowment for Humanities, because there's a role to be played, and it's not just something that is for cities, as Dr. Diaz Rocha was talking about, that this is about reaching underserved communities, sometimes in cities, sometimes in rural parts of different countries, but all of that unlimited human potential and that culture, cultural heritage, art are drivers of jobs and growth in a variety of ways. And you're seeing increasingly that to be the case as a way of transforming, moving away from a commodity-based economy to an innovation-led economic growth economy. So I want to thank all my colleagues. I want to thank Chris Metzger. Again, I want to thank my colleague Rick Ross. I want to thank my friends at the Ministry of Culture in Taiwan. I want to thank Gloria and Dr. Diaz Rocha. Thank you, everybody, for doing this. And that ends our program today. Thank you very much.